we're going to look at one of the most famous shipwrecks of all time.
Well, it is a tragedy that continues to fascinate after more than a century, the Titanic hitting an iceberg and sinking.
For over a century, people have studied every little detail of the Titanic disaster. But despite all this research, there are still shocking facts and details that most of us don't know. What if we told you that a camera was found deep in the ocean, revealing haunting photos of the Titanic? Join us as we uncover these never-before-seen images and take you through the heartbreaking events before, during, and after the ship's tragic sinking. Let's dive in! To begin this exploration, it's best to understand how history's most iconic ship ever came to be. And for that reason, we must rewind the clock to the cold, misty morning of March 31st, 1909. That was the day when a colossal dream began to take shape in the heart of Belfast, Ireland. It was here that the first steel plates were laid, marking the beginning of what would become the most iconic and ill-fated vessel in maritime history. The construction of the most iconic vessel. This wasn't just the construction of a ship. It was the creation of the largest moving object ever built by human hands. A mechanical giant, destined to rule the seas and inspire awe from the world. The colossal project was helmed by Harland and Wolff, one of the most respected shipbuilding firms of the time. Tasked with bringing the vision to life, their workforce poured heart, soul, and staggering technical skill into what would become the RMS Titanic. But the Titanic didn't sail alone in its class. It belonged to a trio of Olympic-class liners, alongside the RMS Olympic and HMHS Britannic. All three were titans of the ocean. All three were wrapped in tragedy. And yet, it was the Titanic that captured the world's imagination before she even touched water. From the very beginning, the ship was surrounded by a mystique, a buzz so electric that newspapers couldn't write enough about her. Crowds gathered just to glimpse the progress. She was a floating palace in the making, promised to redefine luxury and scale forever. What no one expected was that her first voyage would also be her last. White Star Line, the company behind the Titanic, was riding high. Profits were up. Reputation was solid. And with this behemoth under construction, the future looked golden. But the company had no idea that the same ship meant to crown their legacy would come close to destroying it. Today, the construction photos feel like something out of a forgotten dream. Towering steel frames, scaffolding wrapped like spiderwebs around her rising hull, and men, tiny in scale, moving with purpose. Those haunting images now serve as reminders of a time before fate took a deadly turn. Back then, the Titanic wasn't just big, she was a fortress. Floating, majestic, and utterly unmatched. She stretched 882 feet and 9 inches from bow to stern, and her towering height reached 104 feet from keel to bridge. For perspective, that's roughly the size of 3 football fields stacked in a row. The price tag? Just over £3 million. That may not sound like much today, but adjusted for modern times, it would be close to £310 million. In other words, she wasn't just the biggest ship. She was one of the most expensive undertakings of the era. But with all great ambition comes risk, and sometimes a heavy cost. During the 2-year build, the shipyard became a place of silent sorrow. 8 men lost their lives in a series of unexplained accidents. For some, it felt like a shadow had already crept in before the ship ever touched open water. On March 31st, 1912, exactly 3 years after her construction began, the Titanic was officially handed over. The world watched with breathless wonder. But few realized they were also watching the beginning of a tragedy that would echo for more than a century. And let's just say it was the calm before the storm, the Titanic's grand departure. After 2 years of relentless anticipation, the day finally arrived. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic stood poised at the docks of Southampton, England. Towering and gleaming in the morning light, the ship prepared to make her debut before a jaw-dropping crowd of over 100,000, locals, tourists, reporters. It felt like the entire world had shown up just to witness history unfold. But here's what most don't know. The Titanic had already slipped into the sea before this grand event. On April 2nd, she quietly made her way from Belfast, where her story began, to Southampton. That trip, far less glamorous, was a technical test run, a final check before the show. Now, her true journey was ready to begin. Bound for New York City, the Titanic was set to carry more than 2,000 people across the Atlantic. Among them, some of the richest and most powerful individuals on the planet. The planned route was precise, from Southampton to Cherbourg, France, then onward to Queenstown, Ireland, before braving the Atlantic. Her return, a mirrored path back through New York, Plymouth, Cherbourg, and finally home. What they didn't tell you about Titanic's departure. Here's something you might not have heard. When the Titanic was gearing up to sail, the world was in the middle of a coal crisis. A nationwide strike had gripped the British coal industry, grinding many operations to a halt. That meant Titanic couldn't rely on a fresh stockpile. Instead, coal was hastily scavenged from other ships in the White Star Line fleet. The strike ended just before the launch, but by then, it was too late to arrange a full delivery. Titanic would steam forward, powered by borrowed fuel and borrowed time. Now, let's talk numbers. Titanic had a passenger certificate allowing up to 3,547 people on board. That included 905 in first class, 564 in second, and a staggering 1,134 in third. The contrast between those experiences? Startling. A luxury first-class ticket to New York would set you back $2,500. A jaw-dropping $57,000 in today's money. The creme de la creme suites? Worth over $103,000 by modern standards. Meanwhile, a third-class passenger paid around $40, about $900 today. Families in steerage often got split up by gender, as the ship's layout forced men and women into separate sections. With only 2 bathtubs shared among more than 700 third-class passengers, comfort was a rare luxury. Below deck, 60 chefs and assistants hustled in 5 massive kitchens. Every culinary need was covered, from soup to roasts, pastries to veggies. There was even a kosher cook, preparing meals for Jewish passengers observing dietary laws. The Titanic was more than just transportation. It was a floating city, and it took an army to run it. 944 officers and crew kept the ship alive, many of whom would later be remembered not just for their service, but for their courage when disaster struck. Some gave everything to help others survive. But even before disaster arrived, fate gave a quiet warning. As the Titanic pulled away from Southampton on April 10th, a minor scare sent gasps through the gathered crowd. The ship's immense bulk created such a powerful suction that it yanked the nearby SS New York from her moorings. The smaller vessel swung wildly toward Titanic, threatening a collision before the voyage even began. Onlookers froze. But quick thinking and precise maneuvering prevented disaster, just barely. The Titanic continued her journey. In hindsight, some wondered, was that the universe tapping us on the shoulder? Moments from that day have been preserved in photographs. Crowds waving, passengers smiling, officers standing proud on deck. These images feel frozen in time, just before history changed forever. But as the Titanic slipped into open waters, most aboard had no idea that danger was already smoldering deep within. In the dark of the coal bunkers, something else was burning. Fire in the hull. Did you know that the Titanic, our beloved unsinkable ship, was on fire before she even set sail? Hard to believe, right? But it's true. The colossal vessel had been struggling with a fire in one of her coal bunkers for a full 10 days leading up to her maiden voyage. History confirms it. The Titanic wasn't just battling icebergs on its fateful voyage. It had already been engaged in an inferno of its own. This fire, burning out of control in the hull, had the potential to bring the entire ship down even before it hit the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. The truth about this fire has sparked debates for over a century. While some argue that the fire wasn't directly responsible for the Titanic's sinking, there's no denying its impact. The fire damaged the ship's structural integrity, weakening the hull in critical areas. And then there's this chilling fact: the fire was never completely extinguished. In the aftermath of the disaster, an official inquiry revealed just how much the crew struggled to contain the blaze. It raged on for days, its smoke seeping into the air, its heat burning through the ship's bones. Yet no one could fully snuff it out. Journalist Sinan Malini uncovered a shocking piece of history: photos hidden in a dusty attic in England that reveal the fire damage. Look closely, and you'll see a 30-foot-long dark streak along the hull. That's the scar left by the flames. Interestingly, this very section of the ship, already weakened by fire, was where the Titanic struck the iceberg, setting the stage for the catastrophe to unfold. Could the collision have been less disastrous if the ship hadn't already been compromised? We'll never know, but the implications are chilling. What's even more baffling is why the Titanic's officials chose to set sail knowing the ship wasn't in perfect condition. Was it hubris? A miscalculation? Or was it simply the overconfidence of an era that believed nothing could bring this marvel down? The story gets even darker, and what you're about to hear next will shake you to your core. The iceberg warnings. The iceberg that sank the Titanic, perhaps another star of this century-old tale, would be the iceberg that sent the Titanic sinking fast into the cold waters of the Atlantic. On April 14, 1912, the Titanic met its doom while cruising through the night, unaware that the area was filled with icebergs that could sink any ship, including the unsinkable Titanic. But where exactly did this iceberg come from, and what do we really know about its history? According to speculations, the iceberg that sank the Titanic may have originated from the Jakobshavn Glacier near Disco Bay on the west coast of Greenland. The glacier was said to have been formed in 1910 or 1911 and could have drifted north with the West Greenland current. As Captain Edward John Smith and his crew set sail for New York, they were fully aware that the drift ice field was larger in extent and more southerly than in the previous years. That's not all. The Titanic was also said to have received several radio reports from other ships that had traversed the waters, warning of the looming ice fields and icebergs. The first ship to alert the Titanic was La Touraine. The French ship sent the initial warning at around 5:46 p.m. on April 12th, informing the Titanic crew that they had spotted thick field ice in the same area where the Titanic eventually met its doom. On April 13th, Titanic also encountered the Fessy Y steamer Rappahannock, which was heading east. Whether the steamer informed the Titanic of the treacherous waters that lay ahead remains a subject of debate, but Rappahannock also suffered considerable damage from the ice fields, so there's a chance the crew might have shared that crucial piece of information with the Titanic. On the very day of the disaster, the Titanic received several reports of ice fields. and they ignored every single one of them. The first report came from the Coronia at about 12 minutes after 9 in the morning. The Coronia had radioed Titanic, reporting icebergs, growlers, and large fields of ice ahead. But Captain Smith was very confident in his ship and only responded to the message with thanks. Then, at about 11:47, the Dutch ship Noordam also radioed the Titanic through the Coronia. The Noordam informed the Titanic of much ice, warning of the precarious journey that lay ahead. Once again, Captain Smith thanked the ship and shook the message off as if it were nothing. As the day went by, the Titanic received several other warnings and sightings of dangerous icebergs, but they all fell on deaf ears. Eventually, the Titanic crashed into an iceberg and sank, killing over 1,500 passengers and crew members. Now, scientists have discovered an old camera found in the deep ocean, which reveals horrifying Titanic photos. Seaman W. Wood, a keen photographer who was captain of the SS Estonian at the time. Just 2 days before the Titanic went down, the captain sighted this iceberg that was so massive he couldn't help but marvel at the sheer size. He took a picture of the iceberg and noted down the coordinates. Coincidentally, the coordinates matched the same place where the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. Could this be the infamous iceberg that sank the Titanic? Quite possibly. Although we may never accurately verify whether this was the exact iceberg that doomed the Titanic, the correct coordinates stand as a testament to the possibility that this was indeed the culprit behind one of the biggest disasters in recorded history. Eyewitness account. When we think about the Titanic disaster, the stories of survival, panic, and unimaginable terror often rise to the forefront. But one of the most compelling eyewitness accounts comes from Dr. Washington Dodge, a first-class passenger whose written testimony has become one of the earliest and most vivid records of the disaster. Dr. Dodge, a prominent doctor, banker, and politician from San Francisco, had boarded the Titanic along with his wife, Ruth, and their young son, Washington Jr. Little did they know, their luxurious voyage would soon descend into a nightmare. The account, written after Dr. Dodge was rescued by the Carpathia, provides a chilling view into his state of mind. His hurried, almost illegible handwriting paints a picture of a man scrambling to make sense of an impossible situation. The trouble began just after 11:40 p.m., when Dr. Dodge and his wife were violently jolted awake by the crash of the ship colliding with the iceberg. In an instant, the calm of their luxurious voyage was shattered. Dr. Dodge, ever the protector, rushed out onto the deck, desperate for information on the damage. But the assurances he received were far from reassuring. Crew members told him there was no danger at all, and so, reluctantly, he returned to his cabin. But rest was impossible. The gnawing feeling that something was wrong drove him to seek more answers. It was then that a steward delivered the stark news. Passengers had been ordered to put on life jackets. The Titanic, once thought to be unsinkable, was now facing a dire emergency. Without wasting a moment, Dr. Dodge and his family made their way to the starboard boat deck. There, in the freezing cold, they secured a place for his wife and son on Lifeboat 3, the second boat to be lowered from that side of the ship. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Dodge couldn't help but witness the glaring inefficiencies of the evacuation process. Many lifeboats, he noted, were launched only half full, leaving precious room for additional survivors. The biased rule that women and children should board first undoubtedly contributed to the growing list of casualties, as men were left behind in increasingly perilous circumstances. As the lifeboats were lowered into the water, another danger reared its head. Fifth Officer Lowe, who was managing the loading of the boats, positioned the lifeboats into the water with care, but as the ship's massive hull towered above, Water surged from the ship's condenser pump, splashing violently against the lifeboat. The pressure was enough to drown the occupants. The men aboard the lifeboat panicked, shouting for help. But fortunately, they were spared by the quick thinking of the crew. Dr. Dodge's account offers us a rare, behind-the-scenes look at the chaos that unfolded on that cold, moonless night. It reveals not just the physical damage to the ship, but also the breakdown of order, leadership, and human judgment. His testimony is a guided perspective, one of many pieces that help us understand the enormity of the Titanic's final hours. Then, there's the chilling photograph, recently discovered from an old camera found deep beneath the ocean. The image captures the chaos and confusion of the sinking, an unfiltered snapshot of life and death as the ship began its final descent. This haunting image shows passengers, rich and poor, old and young, fighting for survival in the dark waters. It's a reminder of the profound strength of the human spirit when faced with unimaginable peril. As we look at the photograph and consider the eyewitness accounts, we can't help but marvel at the resilience of those who survived the disaster. But we also cannot forget the ones who didn't. The sinking of the Titanic wasn't just a tragic maritime accident, it was a battle against fate itself. This image, along with Dr. Dodge's testimony, paints a picture of a disaster that still resonates today. But the question lingers: what if the lifeboat procedures had been better managed? What if the fire below deck had been fully extinguished? Would more lives have been saved? The mystery of what truly happened aboard the Titanic remains unsolved in many ways, but the survivors' stories, captured in photographs and testimonies, help us piece together the truth. And as we remember their bravery, we also remember the lessons we must learn from the past. What are your thoughts on the eyewitness accounts and the photographs? Drop a comment and let us know. The lifeboat crisis of the Titanic. As the Titanic's final hours unraveled in the cold darkness of the North Atlantic, the frantic scramble to rescue as many souls as possible began. With every passing minute, the chaos on board intensified. The ship, a floating marvel of its time, carried a staggering 2,209 people. But as the disaster unfolded, over half of them would tragically lose their lives. Incredibly, for a ship that was considered the epitome of luxury and safety, the Titanic had only 20 lifeboats. Out of those, only 18 were used, and even then, many of them weren't filled. Why? There were fears that the lifeboats might capsize under the weight of too many people, a panic that only added to the devastating scale of the disaster. But it gets worse. Despite the lifeboats being launched, many never returned to save those still trapped on the sinking ship. According to several reports, officers and crew feared that if they went back, the boats would be overwhelmed by drowning passengers or be dragged under by the weight of the sinking Titanic. So, they sailed away into the dark, leaving hundreds to perish in the icy waters. Now, let's talk about something often debated in the wake of this tragedy. Why weren't there enough lifeboats? The answer is rooted in the regulations of the time. When the Titanic was built, maritime laws required a specific number of lifeboats, and the ship met those standards. But, as we know all too well, those regulations were outdated and woefully insufficient for a vessel this size. In truth, the White Star Line had intentionally minimized the number of lifeboats. Why? They feared that lifeboats would spoil the ship's sleek, luxurious design, prioritizing aesthetics over safety. Shipbuilders at the time insisted that the Titanic could stay afloat long enough to rescue almost everyone on board if something went wrong. The ship was supposed to be unsinkable, after all. But when disaster struck, the Titanic sank faster than anyone could have anticipated. leaving no time for a proper evacuation. To this day, the question of inadequate lifeboats on the Titanic remains one of the most haunting elements of the tragedy. It raises moral and ethical concerns about the choices made by those in charge and how those decisions led to the preventable loss of so many lives. As we continue to unravel the mystery of the Titanic, we'll take a deeper look at the ship's catastrophic breakage. What could have caused the vessel to split in two? Stay with us as we explore the science and the shocking truths behind that fateful event. The Titanic's fatal breakage. Just moments after the Titanic collided with the iceberg, it was already taking on massive amounts of water through the gaping hole in the hull. If you recall, this was the same part of the ship that had already been compromised by the smoldering fire in the coal bunker, a detail that played an undeniable role in the ship's eventual demise. By this point, the gravity of the situation was clear to most of the passengers. They knew the ship was sinking, but no one could have anticipated how rapidly it would go down. As water flooded the lower decks, the breach in the hull worsened, hastening the flow of seawater into the ship. The ship's compartments, once airtight, were now compromised, and the weight imbalance from the increasing volume of water put unbearable strain on the Titanic's structure. Now, let's talk about the ship itself. At over 802 feet long, the Titanic was a mammoth of engineering, but that massive weight, combined with the flooding, created tremendous pressure on the ship's hull. And with the added stress from the breach, the ship's integrity began to unravel. As the ship slowly sank, that immense weight caused the ship's hull to bend and twist. Then, at approximately 2:17 a.m., just over 2 hours after the initial collision, came the fateful moment. The Titanic's hull, unable to withstand the mounting pressure, began to split. The break occurred between the third and fourth funnels, the giant smokestacks that stood as towering symbols of the ship's power. This was the weakest part of the hull, and the iron rivets used to hold it together were far from strong enough to endure such a catastrophic event. This raises a haunting question. Why would a ship built with such an enormous budget use substandard materials in such a critical area? To this day, no one can answer that. It's one of the many mysteries that still linger around the Titanic's construction. While it's difficult to say for certain whether the breakage sped up the sinking, there's no denying that the ship's split remains one of the most defining moments of the disaster. As the ship began to break apart, the echoes of the destruction were heard throughout the night. Survivors who witnessed the horrifying sight could only watch helplessly as the last remains of the Titanic disappeared beneath the icy waves, dragging thousands of lives down with it. Captain Edward John Smith. As the events of the night unfolded, there was one question on the lips of everyone. Where was Captain Edward John Smith? The role played by the captain during the tragedy has remained a subject of debate for many years, and no concrete conclusions have ever been reached. According to eyewitness reports, Captain Smith was said to have appeared on the bridge of the Titanic just moments after the ocean liner collided with the iceberg. As the worst night of the millionaire captain began, he knew this was the end of the legacy he had built for over 40 years. Everything that was happening was partially his fault. While focusing on the frivolities, Captain Smith had ignored the pressing need for a lifeboat drill and instead directed the time to be spent on unnecessary activities. His decision eventually played a huge role in how everything played out. Had the drill been performed, the crew and passengers would have been better equipped to handle the disaster, and many more lives could have been saved. As the Titanic sank further and further into the deep, dark waters, the captain was said to have been heavily involved in the rescue process. There's even a story about him rescuing a baby from the sinking ship, swimming to deliver the baby to a lifeboat, and when the survivors offered him a spot on the boat, he declined, claiming that he would rather perish with the vessel. These tales tell of the remarkable bravery that was exemplified by the captain. But then again, on the other spectrum, some claim that the captain was nowhere to be found as the events of the night unfolded. According to these claims, Captain Smith had abandoned his men in these troubled times when his leadership input could have been invaluable. Whichever version of the story is true, we can't help but wonder at the events that occurred in the last moments of the captain. And then, this also raises another ongoing debate as to whether the captain perished with the ship or made it out alive. According to some wild claims, Captain Smith was said to have gotten out of the tragedy alive and lived the rest of his life on a secluded island, where he lived anonymously. The fact that his body was never found lends some credibility to this theory, although it has never been confirmed. So you should take this with a pinch of salt. Today, Captain Smith's part in the Titanic tragedy is a tale that will be told for centuries to come. But is he a hero or a villain? We'll leave that for you to decide. The discovery of the Titanic wreck. Within just a few days after the Titanic sank, talk began about finding the wreckage. But there was a problem. This was the early 20th century, and the technology of the time wasn't as advanced as today. Although several simple attempts were made to locate the wreckage, serious attempts were not launched until the second half of the 20th century. The first of the notable ones was undertaken by Robert Ballard in August 1985, when he led a joint effort between the American and the French governments from aboard a U.S. Navy research ship known as the Nore. Using a remote-controlled camera known as the Argo, which traveled some 13,000 feet to the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, we were able to get our first glimpse of the wreckage as it lay at the bottom of the ocean. The ship was seen sitting upright in two parts, and this marked the first time the Titanic was seen since it disappeared into the watery graves back in 1912. First ever full-sized view of the shipwreck. Very few shipwrecks have captivated the world's attention like the Titanic. So much so that even after over 100 years, we can't seem to stop talking about it. Recently, a deep-sea mapping company released the first-ever full-size digital scan of the Titanic, giving us a new view of the world's most famous shipwreck. While there have been numerous expeditions to the wreckage since it was first discovered on September 1, 1985, its sheer size and remote location made it extremely difficult for explorers to fully capture the extent of the ocean liner. But thanks to advanced technology, we can now see the full picture of the wreckage in all of its glory. The technology, which was developed by Magellan Limited, allowed scientists to map the Titanic in its entirety, from the bow and stern sections to its 3 to 5 mile debris field. It was like making a digital twin of the wreckage, allowing us to peer even deeper into the depths of the ship like we've never been able to. This new imagery helps to convey both the scale of the disaster and a remarkable level of detail. It has even been called the largest underwater scanning project in history and has generated an unprecedented 16 terabytes of data and more than 715,000 still images and 4K video footage. With this new scanned image, scientists are positive that they will be able to explore certain parts of the wreckage that have been elusive for many years. If you enjoyed this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel. But why stop here? Check out the next video that pops up on your screen.